The alternative way of using this style property and then its nested properties would be that we maybe want to set certain CSS classes on elements. And indeed, I prepared some classes here. In styles CSS, you will see, if you scroll through that file, that there is this warning class, which I actually use in conjunction with the input element. And since there is no space in between, this means that I want to select all input elements that have the warning class applied to them. Whereas if we had a blank in between, this would mean that I want to select all the elements that have a warning class that are child or descendant elements of input. So here I have it without a blank, which means all inputs that have a warning class added to them. And the same for remaining chars. The element with the remaining chars ID should receive this color if it also has the warning CSS class. And out of the box, this warning CSS class is not added to the input or to this span with that ID. It's not added. But that means that if we do add it with JavaScript, we should be able to apply the styles configured for this class whenever that class is added with JavaScript. And that's something we can also do here. For this, I'll again use my span element, and for this I'll quickly reselect it since this page updated. For that I just wrote const span, and then if I press the up arrow, it shows me previously used commands or code lines, and I can just autocomplete them by hitting tab then to save some time, and then hit enter to execute it. Now you only need to do that if the page reloaded, because then that span element constant, which was stored in memory, would be lost otherwise. Now we do have it back, and now to change the CSS classes on that element, we got two main ways of doing that. We do have the class name property. So not class, but class name. The reason is that class actually is a reserved word in JavaScript. We haven't used it yet, but it is a reserved word fulfilling a certain purpose, and therefore this property has class name as a name. And class name then can be set equal to a string value, which is basically the value for the class attribute that will be set on that element. So that could be first dash class, second dash class. Here, using a dash is no problem since we're inside of a string. And if I set this, then for example, we would see that on this span, these classes were added. So whatever you set as a value for class name will be added as the class attribute on that element for which you are setting it. And that's one way of setting classes. And of course, therefore, we could set it to a different string where we don't say first class, second class, but instead warning. Now I would overwrite my classes on that element with that new class string, in this case with only one class, therefore. And if I hit enter, you'll notice that this got orange. Because if we inspect this again, we now see that class is set to warning, and first class and second class were overwritten therefore. And that then in turn has this effect that this CSS rule is becoming active and is applying this color to this element. That's this CSS rule which I showed you a couple of seconds ago, this one here. And that's one way of setting CSS classes with JavaScript. This approach is often great, but it has a disadvantage. If you are doing this on an element that already has a class, which is not the case here, but if you already had a class on that element, let's say this span here already had a class attribute with some class, which is redundant here, but let's say we had this class for some reason already, then whenever you do override it, So if I reselect my span element here, and I then override class name with warning, then this warning class would be applied, but we see the old class, some class, is missing now. It was overwritten. And that might sometimes be what you want, but sometimes it's also not what you want. Now, the solution for this would be that you set class name equal to warning and then the class which you want to persist, so which you don't want to lose. But that, of course, means that you always need to remember which classes are already on that element, or you always need to write some extra code that looks at the element, extracts the existing classes, and then appends a new class. And that gets even more annoying if you then want to remove a class, because then you have to overwrite the existing string of class names with a new string, which is all the old class names minus the one you want to remove. It's all doable, but it can be annoying. That's why in addition to class name, we also have the class list property. And class list actually is an object with a couple of utility methods that make managing classes on HTML elements easy. For example, you have an add method which you can execute like this, to which you pass a string which contains the class name or class names which you want to add, like warning. And now that will add this. And we also have a remove method which removes the class name which you're passing here, and only that class, no other class names. So here with that, if we now inspect this again after executing remove, you see this is gone. And if I would reload this entire page so that some class is set, since this is set initially here, if I now would get access to my span element again, if I then first of all execute class list add warning like this, then if we inspect this again, we see that some class is still there, but in addition warning was added. And if I go back and I remove warning, so if I change add to remove here and execute this, then hopefully unsurprisingly, we see that some class is still there and warning was removed. And therefore, you can also change classes besides those styles with the style attribute, either by using class name to override the class attribute or class list to manage it in a more elegant way. And often class list, of course, is the better choice since you have more fine-grained control over what's going on. And that's how you can change styling of elements. And of course, not just of span elements, but of any elements that you can style with CSS. Now that's also the conjunction of CSS and JavaScript, and we see how these two languages work together with help of style and of these class properties. Now let's move on to the conditional part. Because now that we know how we can add and remove the warning class, we of course want to do that conditionally based on the amount of characters the user entered. We only want to do that if there are less than 10 remaining characters.